Ah, Good afternoon, or in the case of anybody this side of the Atlantic, evening. Um, Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives. I'm Chris Eyre, and with me at the moment, back after a few weeks off, is Elgin Hushbeck. Hopefully, we may have also Alan Bevere with us later, but he's been having some problems with connection. So, to kick us off with the first topic that came to mind, what on earth is happening with this armed militia takeover of a nature reserve, Elgin?
Well, it's a kind of a complex issue because there's two things really going on. There's the background that inspired it, and then there's the reaction. And what's really getting covered for the most part is the reaction. And I tend to agree with the condemnation of the reaction for many reasons. One is that I don't think it's warranted yet. But the other thing, essentially what's the background is you have this area which back in the, I think under Teddy Roosevelt was declared a wildlife refuge. And apparently, depending on who you talk to, there's a lot of conflicting stories here, which is always part of the problem. But from the militia side, from the part that's being inspired, the government has been moving kind of heavy-handedly to force people around the area off their land so that they can expand the property. There's some allegations about a flood that occurred many years ago that wiped out a lot of homes, and at which point the people chose to just to go ahead and sell out to the government. And there's some accusations that the flood was contributed to or whatever by the government. I'm not taking a position one way or the other on that. But it does seem that the more recent one is the owners of the ranch, the two people in question, did what is called a controlled burn, which is in the West out here is very common. The government does it, ranchers do it. It's just something people do from time to time to control their crops or their land. And as will happen from time to time, they get out of hand. You are dealing with fire. And even government control burns sometimes get out of hand. And this one did about $1,000 worth of damage to this wildlife refuge, at which point this is where things really get confusing to me. They were fined something like $450,000, and they were tried to put into the jail. They finally did a plea bargain and agreed to go, one for a couple of months, one for a little over a year. Fine, good. And then suddenly the government is now coming back and saying, we didn't like that. We want you to go to jail for a lot longer time. And so this is kind of the spark that people are going, enough already. Again, I don't agree with the militia. The fact the family doesn't agree with the militia. I think it's important on this one to split it up two ways. One between what's the reaction of the militia and then what's actually the event behind it.
Most of it is not really understandable from a UK perspective. I mean, in the UK, if the government had wanted it for a wildlife reserve, they would have compulsorily purchased it, and they wouldn't have needed to use underhand methods. I don't know whether that's feasible with you.
Yeah, they can do that here as well. That's one of the confusing aspects. But the problem is if the government puts pressure on the farmers, they can force a small group of farmers off their land, and nobody really knows what's going on. I mean, nobody knew. Although I don't agree with the militia, I think one of the things that they did do is they brought this all out into the light. I would say, hey guys, you've completed your task, go home now. But if they wanted to go through the process of condemning the land, that requires a lot more public involvement that's can be sometimes messier. The other aspect of it that may differ from the UK, I know it differs from the East Coast, is when you're on the East Coast of the United States, the vast majority of the land in states like New York, Connecticut, that's their own, almost all is owned by private citizens. The farther you move out west, the greedier the government got as the country expanded. And so you go to states like Nevada, 97% of the state of Nevada, I think is the statistic, it may not be exact, but it's close, is owned by the federal government. So you get out west and you have these huge tracts of land that are owned by government, and people living in the area are oftentimes, for a long time, the government let them go hunt or do whatever they want on the land, and then suddenly they're blocking these things off, which is also causing a lot of tension.
Yeah, I mean, from the little I've seen of Nevada, I wouldn't have imagined an awful lot of people would want to take bits of it off the government. But yeah, I then looked at this business of the sentencing for what's apparently supposed to be arson. Now, here we actually banned burn-offs by private individuals a considerable while ago, in my lifetime, but quite some time ago, because they got out of control far too often. But we are a rather small country, and there are few farms that aren't close to inhabited property, and you can obviously see that one might want to take more care. But then I see this business of mandatory minimum sentences, and it all starts looking terribly blown out of proportion. And were it here, we would definitely be talking about the punishment being massively out of scale to the offence, and we'd be appealing it to the European Court of Human Rights if nowhere else. So that seems wrong to me. Do you think this is general with the legal system in the States? Is it overly punitive? Because I would not want to support a really punitive legal system from a Christian perspective. You have to temper justice with mercy.
Well, it is one of the problems we have, is that we have multiple legal systems. I mean, if you go and rob a bank, you will end up in the court system, and that's generally pretty good. I mean, there's no court system is perfect, but it's generally pretty good. On the other hand, if you're going up against the federal government, and in particular if you're going up against one of the agencies like the EPA or the Interior Department or something like that, they've been allowed to set up their own courts. And so they end up writing the regulations, and then if you violate one of these regulations, you end up going to their court, which they own. And so, it's like going into a town. I've heard it described this way. You go into a town and you get into a conflict with Bill, and you go to goes before the sheriff, which is Bill's brother, and then you get taken to the court of law, which is Bill's father. And then if you need to appeal, you get Bill's grandfather does the appeal. So,
okay. Yeah.
So, and I think that maybe one of the things that's going on here is we're not dealing with a criminal case per se, but we're dealing with a conflict with one of the government agencies. And even if you get it into the court system, there's actually in a court doctrine that's written up by legal scholars and, quote, everyone agrees with, well, not agrees with it, but at least acknowledges it, is that the courts give deference to the Interior Department or the other departments or whatever. Whenever one of these other courts makes a ruling, the court will give deference to it. And thus, for example, we had one go all the way up to the Supreme Court where a company was fined for not labeling the door of a storage room that it contained poison. The poison this room contained was sand, just regular old sand. But because sand, one of the components is silicate, and silicate was listed as a poison, then it was supposed to, regulatory agency said you need to list that as poison, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically said, well, these departments in theory know what they're doing, so we're going to defer to them.
I couldn't see that happening here, to be utterly honest. There are some pretty silly decisions occasionally, but that is a Lulu. And finally, there's this business of an armed militia taking over some government land. I mean, it's where you've got it slanted from the left. It's taking over a government building. It's an unoccupied building, and it's a wildlife reserve. So I'm not saying the building's particularly significant. But here, if we saw a set of armed people taking over any land and excluding other people from it, we'd have the boys from Hereford in black balaclavas dropping in there the next day.
Well, we would probably too, except we've had a couple of bad publicity experiences in the past. We had Ruby Ridge,
yes,
we had Waco, and these things tend to, all societies have their nuts. And I'm going to get in trouble with the militias here, but all societies have their nuts. Both sides, the left has their nuts and the right has their nuts. And unfortunately, these are fringe people. A country of 300 and some odd million people, you can find 50 of them who are kind of fringe. And that's the problem we're having. On the other hand, you look at them and, there's some justification to what their anger is. That's where the real rub comes in. And it's not like it's just this one case. There's been lots of these all throughout the West. And there's a huge issue going on now with sage grouse and, potential government restrictions on lands. And there's going back for decades now, there's been a revolt in the West building, and this is just a manifestation of that. Again, I don't condone it. I think they're wrong. I wish they would go home, but that's essentially what's going on.
Again, from a Christian point of view, I could easily condone a set of unarmed people going and occupying the place for a while as a non-violent protest. But as soon as guns start being involved, I am thinking armed rebellion.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just endemic in the States because that's what you founded on.
Well, in some respects, we kind of did that to you, didn't we?
Yes. I don't know. Okay.
I thought we kind of got over it after 1812, but...
Yeah. I think that's about as much as I could extract from that item. So let's move on to this business at Wheaton College and the Professor Larissa Hawkins, who I see as a tenured professor, who, well, I mean, the initial event seems to be that she wore a hijab in sympathy with Muslim women as a gesture. Made a comment about, after all, Islam worshipped the same God on, I think it was Twitter, and first she gets suspended, and then there seem to be proceedings to fire her completely, ostensibly because there's question about whether she still subscribes to the Wheaton College Statement of Faith, which she has said she completely endorses and has expanded on that at huge length. This is supposedly the premier evangelical college in the States. What is going on there?
I'm not really sure, because I've read a number of stories, and it's getting, to me, it's becoming a he said, she said, because I've read some articles where the college is saying We have no problem with people wearing. We actually didn't say no problem. There's no policy. We don't. There's, as far as college is concerned, they don't care whether she wears a hijab or not, and that their issues had to do more with theology, and the statement of faith. On the other hand, I mean, it's like, I think one of the problems here, and why I very, very tentatively lean towards the college at the moment, is the college is not saying a whole lot, at least in the officially, which is because they're concerned this is an ongoing process, and they don't want to. There's usually in colleges like this, there's usually a lot of rules about going public with certain things until things are finalized. So, and they seem to be keeping fairly quiet. But again, that doesn't mean she's wrong. I really don't know. If it's the fact that all she did was wear a hijab, I would think that's a huge overreaction.
Yeah.
If she wore a burqa, I could begin to see that. I have a problem with burqas because to me they dehumanize women. They turn them into, when I see a burqa, my first thought is, a clone warrior in Star Wars. I mean, there's a reason they all wear the exact same faceless uniform, is because they're not supposed to be actually individual people. They're supposed to be clones.
Okay.
And when you turn women into burqas, I mean, they cease to be people. They're moving blobs of cloth with a slit across the eyes. But this wasn't a burqa. This was a hijab. So I really don't know what's going on there. And I think to me, it's one of the many instances of frustration I have with our media, where they take something and they run with the angle that they think is sensational. And I'm not always sure that the angle they're running with actually gives us the entire truth.
Okay. I mean, I worry about this because one of the things I tend to expect from the term professor with tenure is the freedom to take political stances without the fear of dismissal. And I'm looking at this and thinking, this is looking as if it's going against the very principle of tenure, on some kind of doctrinal ground which has to be extremely subtle. If the lady says that she endorses Wheaton College's statement of faith, which I may say I couldn't possibly endorse myself, and there's nothing in what she's said which could be contrary to that, which again, I've seen several evangelicals saying there is nothing in what she's said which could contravene what they've written. What I have to be looking at is that there's some unwritten principle that's been breached here, and I'm struggling to get at what it is. I mean, there's one commentator who says that this is not a popular attitude for someone who is politically conservative, and most of the funds for Wheaton come from politically conservative sources, and somehow or other conservative, evangelical, religiously conservative has got mixed up with politically conservative here. Do you feel there might be some of that?
Well, at this point, I mean, as I said, my big problem is there is something. I mean, the college itself is not talking. I mean, it's important to point out that they've not made a decision. And evidently, one thing I did see in one article was that the decision to make it move to the next step was their perceived lack of an answer to some inquiries in December. Again, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know what the underlying cause is. I know there's a controversy going on. It's in process. It's sort of like in here we have a grand jury system where the prosecutor is allowed to present evidence, but anything that happens in the grand jury is, in theory, secret. Sometimes it leaks out, but for the most part, it remains secret. And so you can speculate all you want about what might be the cause and what might be.
Okay.
I mean, I could make something up here. Let me just say I'm making it up just to make an example here. But what if she had sent an email that directly challenged or potentially directly challenged one of their statements of faith?
Yeah.
And they're questioning her about that, and she's refusing the answer. So now they move it to the next stage. They don't release what's going on because it's under investigation, and they don't want to. And I think they shouldn't release that. Now, again, I don't know if that's what the case is, but I think the problem is here we are dealing with speculation in the media, which is not always correct about what may or may not be going on. Like I said, I can definitely state that if all she did was wear a hijab, and then fine, they should not be pursuing this. But at this point, I don't really know. On the other hand, I would say in terms of a tenured professor, most places have, even if you're tenured, they still have some grounds on which they can dismiss you. If you become a serial killer, they can probably find grounds to dismiss you. I know they had Churchill was a tenured professor out in Colorado. And when he made some offending statements about 9/11, basically saying that the Jews who were there deserved it, they began looking in him to see if they could find some grounds. And they were able to find out that he had actually committed plagiarism in a number of spots, and were able to actually get rid of him. So there can be grounds, I would think, at a Christian college. Either a liberal or a conservative Christian college, or any religious institution. If someone does not or no longer upholds the doctrines on which the institution is based, that would be grounds to end tenure.
Sure.
Whether I particularly agreed with those doctrines or not. I mean, if someone could, if the Catholic college wanted to get rid of a teacher because they didn't hold to transubstantiation, I would think they were perfectly in their rights to do that, even though I don't particularly accept that particular doctrine. So,
yes. The only thing I could see in that I have had a few evangelicals in this country counter is the statement that Muslims worship the same God, and I know a few people, including some clergy, who would say that Muslims do not worship the same God because they do not, for instance, worship a Trinitarian God. The fact that it's ostensibly the God of Abraham and prophets thereon forward, that we both adhere to, seems to make no difference there. And I don't think that there's anything in their statement of faith, which I have read, which says you cannot say that somebody who has a perhaps erroneous conception of the fullness of what it is to be God is worshipping the same God. That was the only thing I could find in there. And I had wondered if you knew something I didn't. But anyhow, let's perhaps move this on from there, because just before Christmas, there was an article about the 50-year anniversary of Nostra Aetate, which was the start of a Catholic move to more interfaith dialogue. There's been a statement by Orthodox rabbis recently saying that some interaction with Christians is not necessarily a terrible idea. The Vatican's certainly said that Jews don't need Christ in order to be saved at this point. There've also been moves kicking around for various churches to get closer together. But I thought we'd start with the interfaith dialogue. And are we doing any better with interfaith dialogue than we were 50 years ago, do you think?
Well, I think there needs to be a lot of understanding about what it means to be interfaith dialogue. Mm-hmm. I have no problem with interfaith dialogue where we get together with people. I do this myself, where I talk to people of other faiths. I do it politely. I do it, in a sense of understanding. I try to learn from them. I believe that Christianity is the only true way to worship God, but I don't believe any Christian actually has it 100%. And I don't believe all these other religions are 100% wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I can learn things from other religions that will help me be a better Christian. But when I say that, I suddenly feel like I have to have a whole bunch of qualifications. Because I think interfaith dialogue done that way, in terms of gaining a different perspective, because our perspective, my perspective, our perspective is largely shaped by 2,000 years of Christian history. Mm-hmm. And we know that 2,000 years of Christian history, the church, let me say, deviated a couple of times, right? And hasn't always been the church that Christ would hope it would be. But we still carry a lot of that baggage with us. And so by talking to other religions, we can get a different perspective that may help us rethink some of the things and come to a closer, deeper, and I would argue more biblical relationship with Christ. Now, on the other hand, if the focus of the interfaith dialogue is to see if what we can toss out so that we all can be the same religion. Well, we'll drop off this doctrine because it offends these people, and we'll throw away that doctrine because it offends us. See if we can find some common core that we can all agree on. Mm-hmm. That type of interfaith dialogue I'm very skeptical of and not very supportive of.
Okay. I was thinking about this particularly as I've recently been doing some editing work on a new book meditating on Paul's letters, and obviously there is an argument, particularly from Romans, that Judaism and the covenant is an entirely superseded covenant, and poor people, their eyes have been blinded, and a stumbling block has been put in their way, and if they would only see the way to accepting Christ, all would be okay. But at the moment, they're basically stuffed. There have been moves, theological moves, to produce a far better and far less exclusionary and supersessionary attitude than that, notably New Perspective on Paul. And I think the Vatican got there somewhat before the Protestants arrived at the New Perspective on Paul, to be utterly honest. But it has always worried me, particularly with Judaism, that we have our roots in a religion where, for the most part of our history, we've been persecuting them horrendously, and they've had a standard prayer calling down effectively fire and brimstone on us.
I would like to avoid that.
Which is not necessarily the best basis for a good relationship. Yeah. I mean, I'm very encouraged by the statement from the Orthodox rabbis in that connection.
Yeah.
I would far more like to see some continuity going on there, and some recognition that while we may have a slightly better version in some respects, it is not a completely groundbreaking break in the two. I mean, I have to bear in mind all the time that, let's face it, Jesus was a Jew for all his life, and he was never actually a Christian, technically. So
technically, yeah.
And he's the guy we follow. So there's one other
one of the interesting, if I could jump in here, one of the interesting paradoxes that kind of ties back to the previous discussion, or the earlier part of this discussion on interfaith dialogue, is the paradox that for basically 1700 and some odd years, 1776 years, the Europe was primarily focused on the New Testament, and they were very, even though they followed the New Testament doctrine of love, they were also very hostile to Jews and very prejudicial to Jews. On the other hand, one of the distinguishing aspects of American Christianity, at least in its very early years, is its focus on the Old Testament. And it was much more grounded. In fact, many of the founding fathers, they tied the move away from Britain with the Exodus, and that was a central part to it. And the Liberty Bell has the verse from Leviticus on it: "Let freedom ring throughout the land." And so there was much more of this focus on the Old Testament, and yet, therefore, we've never had the persecution. I mean, one of the little facts here is every synagogue still has the escape hatch built, or most, I don't know if they still do, but for very many years, they had the escape hatch built in where they could get out real quick should the Christians surround the building and start destroying it. But there's never one that was ever used in the United States.
Yes. And we now seem to be quite close to doing much the same to Muslims. Certainly in France, for instance, Muslims feel very, very nervous about the status of mosques.
That is often raised as a concern here, but it's still 6-1 Jews in terms of FBI statistics here. In terms of religious motivated crimes, the amount of religious motivated crimes is 6 times higher against Jews than against Islam.
I see more against Islam here, but probably we have a relatively rather smaller Jewish population and a relatively larger Islamic one.
Yeah.
One point before we leave the completely interfaith aspect, having been Epiphany this week, we were doing a study on the Magi, or three kings, except that they weren't kings and there weren't necessarily three of them.
But barring that,
in small group this week, it struck me forcibly that calling them Magi, you're basically calling them astrologer magicians from Chaldea, from a different religion and a foreign country. And they are the ones who, at least in Matthew, are first seeing the truth of matters as against the dominant religion, Judaism, there. So I took from that a moral that we should definitely not be blind to the possibility that people from foreign cultures and foreign religions might be able to see things we can't occasionally.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example. Well, risk danger here. I was an atheist, and then I became a Christian. And in my early years as a Christian, I studied at a liberal university. So I studied both liberal Christianity, and I studied Eastern religions, and I studied under a Buddhist. And one of the important lessons I learned from him was not to become a Buddhist. he may be depressed about that, but I actually learned much better why I am not a Buddhist and why I would have trouble being a Buddhist, but that's a different story. But one of the things that I thought was kind of valuable is he had a view of reincarnation, which was not that you're born and, that we typically think you born and grow up, die, become a baby again, and grow up and die and become a baby. He had a view of reincarnation that we are born and die I don't know how he got around to it, but basically it's like every 20th of a second or something.
Oh, okay.
And that our karma was everything we have done in our lives up to the point where we're living. And I actually saw that as a very interesting way of looking at sin and what sin does to us, because sin is something that doesn't just happen at the moment. If I were to, heaven forbid, have a moment of craziness and go out and have an affair, and I could come back and say, well, I'm done with that. I could, that was just a moment of indiscretion. I'm just going to put that behind me. But you know what? I couldn't just put that behind me. That would be part of me for the rest of my life, and it would affect me in some fashion many years into the future. And it also helped me come up with a better understanding of the grace of God, because I think one of the parts of salvation, that when God comes to us and makes us into a new creature, that he washes away a lot of that past life. What we've done up until that point, that's the cleansing that Christ gives us. And we still have some of the residual habits and things that carry forth, but Christ's cleansing of our sins and setting us free from our bondage is in many respects breaking with our past and allowing us to live new lives, which we unfortunately normally toss aside and to return back to our old ways and begin building up a whole new reservoir of bad karma. But that is an insight I got from a Buddhist. But it's not a Buddhist doctrine. It's just an insight that I can look into Christianity, and I can look at what he said, and I can say, is there any value in that? And it make me understand my sinful nature and in terms of Christian context. And I think it does. I think it does help me understand sin and what it does to and how it corrupts the soul in a way that I didn't really understand before.
Okay. So really, you're talking about the sinful you is crucified with Christ and dies, and you are reborn anew. I have to say that a lot of people I know in and outside the church seem to need that process repeating quite a few times, but
as do I.
Yes. Yeah, I have also explored other areas. I was an atheist at 10 and arrived aged 14 at a mystical experience which stopped me being an atheist, but I had no idea where to go at that point. So I looked in a lot of places.
Sounds like we had a similar background.
Yeah, I'll say this: the Eastern traditions have some very good tips on meditation, which I still use.
Yeah,
which is practicalities. A lot less
even
in
the Old Testament. It tells us to meditate on God's words, and sometimes we actually don't do that because we're afraid we're going to be, we're getting into an Eastern religion with meditation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think.
But I'm very keen in terms of prayer on not spending the whole time babbling at God, but actually spending some time waiting to hear if there's an answer.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I know I probably sound like the annoying person that comes up and talks, and you can't get a word edgewise until they're done and they walk off, and you never actually said anything.
Yes. I like to keep prayers short and to the point and with a lot of spaces between them, I have to say.
Well, I believe very much in terms of the interfaith dialogue. I be very much in Paul's teaching, test everything, hold on to the good.
Yeah.
And so I look to see, is there anything good? And if there is, then I want to hold on to that part and throw away the rest.
Okay, well, I've done a terrible job of finding the halfway point to do blurbs, but I have no particular wish to advertise anything. Elgin, do you want to mention your books and your blog at this point?
Well, I'm Elgin Hushbeck, and you can get my blogs sometimes when I get around to posting them at hushbeck.com. And these days, I'm actually posting more on the Energeon discussion network, which is energeon.co/discuss. And I'm going to be having 2 posts coming up fairly soon. I just had one on Is there a War on Christmas? Yeah. And then I've got one coming out, I believe it's on the 18th, or it's very soon, on is capitalism a Christian economic system? And then one sometime after that on should Christians support the death penalty? And I'll be taking pro on both of those, and then there'll be somebody else that they have writing the con.
On capitalism, it'll be me doing the con.
All right.
What a surprise to the system. Yeah. Just sticking with the interfaith and narrowing it a bit. There have been calls recently for a more secular England by a commission on religion and society. We have an established church in the Church of England, and on recent polls, no more than 20% of people in the country actually identified as Anglican. I think we are still round about the 50% identifying themselves as Christian of some description. But that's involved a lot of call for us to see ways of bringing other religions into public life. I know you have this separation of church and state, but we have this long tradition of the needs to be religion in the public square, religion in affairs of state, and we have increasingly tried to do it on an interfaith basis, which has led, for instance, to trying to find a way of praying which is not going to offend any of Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. That does take a little skill to do. But I'm also seeing reports recently saying that we may be witnessing the death of Christianity in America. Do you think that this is just going to fade into the background of secular society that arguably the country's set up to do, or do you have sort of leanings about bringing things into the public square there too, perhaps?
Well, I think one of the issues now, this is somewhat in my, particularly the early part of my book, Christianity and Secularism. Mm-hmm. I reject the idea that this is a move to be more inclusive, at least in the United States. I can't really speak for what's going on in England. Mm-hmm. But in the United States, it's not. The United States was founded, by the way, we do not have a separation of church and state. Or at least we didn't until the Supreme Court rewrote the Constitution, which they tend to do. You can look high and low in the Constitution. There's nowhere does it say separation of church and state. It actually says government shall not establish a religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof.
Yeah.
And the first part tends to be ignored, and the second part is completely ignored. And what you have here, the problem I think you have is there's a difference between secular and secularism. And when you start pushing secularism, which is what's really going on, secular is it's like you said, trying to be a little bit more accommodative. It's important to note, for example, the Congress that passed the First Amendment into law, the very next day in celebration, ordered a day of prayer and fasting, or passed a law for a day of prayer and fasting. So they didn't want to separate religion from government. What they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that government didn't establish a particular church or religion such that it would then use its power to suppress all other forms of worship. They wanted to leave that out in the public square.
Yep.
Let everybody fight out in the public square. What we have now is we actually have the becoming established, the religion of secularism. And I do believe it is a religion. And it is now using its power to push out of the public square any form of expression. You see this, and again, the most obvious one is the war on Christianity, but it's in a lot of other places as well. Because the idea that we're not supposed to have any mention of religion in the public square. Well, how can a Christian not be a Christian, or be a Christian and express their values as a citizen? So I think this is one of the things I have. If you're trying to be more tolerant and go to more of an American model where you encourage religion, but you let the people figure out which one they want to join and what they want to do, or you're going to this idea, well, we're basically setting up an atheistic state that is suppressing the expression of religion anywhere it can.
I must admit, perhaps unusually for someone with generally liberal views, I take the view that the way the Constitution got worded did not create a wall of separation between church and state. That was part of a side letter, but that was from one of the founding fathers. And
Thomas Jefferson.
You cannot hold that as representing the views of all of them, and I think the Supreme Court made a huge mistake at that point. I mean, it seems to me that you can't actually get on in US politics in most circumstances without being fairly noisily Christian, or possibly Jewish. I doubt you could make much headway as a Muslim at the moment, for instance, though I may be wrong.
One in Congress.
You have one in Congress?
Yes.
Well done. We have quite a few Muslim MPs these days, including a few members of the House of Lords now. But there has to be there seems to have to be a religion. Though I believe you have at least one atheist senator as well.
Yeah,
self-avowed.
I think the problem with religion is it's not so much religion per se. I mean, it's certainly been in the past. It's for me at least the really big issue is do you accept American tradition? Do you? And that's where I wouldn't have much problem with anybody. I would have a question, honestly, if a Muslim ran, simply because if the Muslim is supporting Sharia law is inconsistent with American principles. But if a Muslim says, no, I don't want to impose Sharia law in this country, that would be great. And no problem. Let them run for office. No problem at all. That's the only qualification I would put in there. Okay. That anybody running for office should support the principles on which this country is based, which, quite honestly, are largely culturally Christian. And I put the word culturally in there because it doesn't have to be a Christian to be within the values of this country.
Yes. I would have said that this country is more culturally Christian than it is avowedly Christian still.
Yeah.
But it's a lot less culturally Christian than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago when I was still relatively young. Certainly when I was growing up, it was a very sensible question to ask whose which church someone's parents went to in the days when I was at school, which church you went to. These days, it really is not a sensible question in a conversation, because the odds are they'll say, "Oh, are you one of those God botherers?"
You're getting more and more of that in the United States.
Yeah.
It's probably not a normal question to ask somebody, what church do you go to? Because there's a significant part of the population that doesn't go to church. You don't quite get I mentioned quite freely that, that I go to church, that I teach Bible study. I mean, that if anyone asks me my schedule, well, Tuesday nights I'm studying for my Bible study class, which I teach on Sunday. So I don't have any problem mentioning it, but it's not something that I ask people until I find out that they're Christian. And there's a growing, tiptoeing around the, I don't have much of it, but I see people tiptoeing around the issue. Once they find out that I'm a Christian, then there's almost this sigh of relief, and then they kind of open up as to.
Yes.
And that, I think, is sad. I mean, I would like people to be open and to be able to express. If someone comes up to me and says they go to a mosque or they go to a synagogue or they go to a Buddhist temple, that's fine. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna jump all over them but I don't like the idea that people feel increasingly in a country that's so overtly Christian that we somehow have to keep that secret and we're not allowed to express it, or our views are somehow invalid because we are not Christian, because we're Christians and therefore they don't really count. That's kind of what I'm battling with when I battle with the tendency towards secularism as opposed to secular. Well, I kind of like the way our founding fathers set up the government as a secular government, but as a religious culture. I kind of like the way they set that up.
Well, I'm well used to the fact that in order to get anything done politically here, you have to set up a non-religious argument for it, because you cannot really expect to get majorities using religious arguments on any topic. Even big topics like, for instance, abortion.
Yeah. I agree with that fully. I mean, I think Christians who argue the Bible says are doing themselves a disservice. But I run into people, I'm quite frequently, I run into people that, because I'm pretty open to that, I'm a Christian, and I will give a secular argument against abortion. Yeah. And it will be dismissed as, oh, well, you're just religious. Even though the argument was secular, the argument had nothing to do with religion. And quite frankly, I was pro-life long before I knew of a good religious argument for it.
Okay.
But
it's good. We are slightly short of remaining time at this point to move ourselves into the last item that I had in mind, but it sort of links in, bearing in mind that your no establishment of religion clause is there because there was persecution in England at an earlier stage. And our persecution in England was largely due to two things. One, that we declared UDI from Catholicism under Henry VIII and effectively nationalised the English Church.
He did divorce.
Yes, which then meant that popes for the next 100 years spent a lot of time excommunicating English monarchs and ordering their more faithful subjects to invade us, which does tend to make one a little paranoid about remaining Catholics in the country. And then, of course, we have the Civil War, at which point the Roundheads take over, and however right they might have been in terms of constitutional principles, there was a huge, very radical Protestant group among them, which succeeded in doing things like banning Christmas, banning dancing and theatre and singing and all that kind of stuff that actually makes life a bit fun on occasion.
Yeah, we actually picked up a lot of that over in the States because they came over here.
So we were a bit chary about both the extremes for some time. But recently we've been getting an awful lot of people thinking suddenly, oh, the Pope is making an awful lot of sense. I wonder, how much do you regret the fact that we don't have one church?
I guess I would love everybody to be in one church. On the other hand, I'm kind of happy with the way things are developing within the evangelical community here in the United States, which is, I think we're actually moving closer and closer back to the the early New Testament model, where there was no really established church, but you had basically a whole lot of individual churches. And you find in the United States, the churches that are really dynamic, the churches that are really growing, are the evangelical churches, and they're for the most part either non-denominational, or when they are denominational, they don't put their denomination first. So they're, for example, I go to a church that's called Highland Community Church.
Okay.
Nothing says what denomination that is. And if you go in, you don't see a lot of denominational stuff. Now, if you dig down in, you find out that they are an EV free church. And now, I don't know if you have a free church concept in the United States, but in the early days of the church in America, they would have pews, and you would actually rent your pews as part of your donation. And the good people would have the big pews up front. And and then we had this movement go through to make free churches where you could come in and just go everywhere. Now, everything's a free church nowadays. We don't have the concept, at least not that I know of purchasing a pew, but at least not that you can only you can sit in. But but the free church is where we get the evangelical free church, is where that part of the name comes from, and it's there, but it's kind of back in the background, and you just don't see it a lot. And people are now moving much more between churches because they like the pastor, or they like the music, or they like the just the atmosphere, or whatever, for issues more of style and preference as opposed to theology. And which isn't to say that theology isn't important. It's still very important in terms of evangelical. But beyond that, it's becoming one large church. And so either people are Lutheran churches or whatever, but they're being pulled together more by theology, not by denominational structure. Obviously, there's still the mainline churches. The Catholic Church is going to be a kind of an issue because, if you come to Highland, you can take communion, right? No big deal. If I go to a Catholic church, my daughter is Catholic. If I were to go to her church, I can't quite take communion. So there's still some issues like that, but even those are getting kind of downplayed.
I don't know many, if any, Catholic churches which practice open table communion, I have to admit. And technically speaking,
I don't know of any either. I'm just saying the division line isn't as stark.
Technically, I suppose the Anglican churches I go to also don't practice entirely open communion, in that they require you to be a follower of Christ. But they don't exclude Catholics. Catholics tend to exclude Anglicans, but that may not last, because there's some communality has come back between Catholics and Lutherans and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox recently. It's possible that there might be a new drawing together, and I suppose in a way, while I recoil at the idea of unelected authorities, I've got a bit of Pope envy, because just at the moment they've got this guy who can speak for Catholics generally, although quite a lot of them then go out and say, no, not us, who makes a load of sense.
Yeah.
There is a unified voice there, even if it's not accepted by everybody. And the thousands of Protestant churches do find it difficult to find a common voice anywhere.
Yeah, and actually one of the problems is depending on who the reporter is, if the reporter wants to show Christianity in a good light, they'll go to a reasonable person, and there are many of them out there.
Yeah.
If they want to show Christianity in a bad light, which quite frankly the media here loves to do, they will go find somebody that I wouldn't go within a mile of their church.
Yeah.
And they'll speak as, this is what Christians believe. I mean, basically Elmer Gantry will be portrayed as the voice of Christianity.
True enough. We are over time, unfortunately, at this point. So we may return to one or two of these points at a later stage. And I suspect a fortnight hence, we may be talking about capitalism a bit. So
you think?
I think it's a distinct possibility.
You would tell me how you read my article and I completely converted you.
I have my doubts, but we will see.
I have my hopes.
Anyhow, thanks for watching, those who are, and have a good week, and hope to see you next week.
All right.